live stream. This week we've got David Fields, and we're going to talk about international economics. It's a topic that's not covered very much. Can we change it? Be kind, stay safe, and enjoy the show. Welcome back to the live stream. I'm Ty Keens. It is September 9th, 2023. We were going to have David Fields here with us today, but he has a family member that has fallen ill. Hopefully everything's fine. We'll have him back in a few months, but we got the rest of the guys here. We'll bring on the man himself, Professor Steve Keen. Here he is.
Hi, Ty. I hope David doesn't have COVID in the family, but that's fairly high odds since I've just actually had my own first dose of it in the first time in 3.5 years. So we'll see.
Yeah. Could be. Hopefully everything's okay. Hello to everybody in the chat. Josh, WWE fan 0104 is here. Ghost on the half shell. She is here as always. Tom Roberts, I've seen you quite a few times over the last few weeks. Glad you could join us again. And Mike's already in the chat, chatting away with everybody. We're gonna try to switch things up. We'll still talk about international economics. Of course, a lot of you guys have seen my recent Twitter or X post with my new model. That includes somewhat of a foreign sector, so we'll get to that. But we'll kind of cover the basics of economics first. We'll get Steve's opinion. We'll get Mike's opinion. And we'll get the philosopher, the in-house philosopher's opinion. That would be Daniel Sanderson. Here he is.
Thank you.
Dan, how you doing?
Pretty good. Yeah.
Pretty good.
Yeah.
Anything happening this week we should know
about? No, just... changing things up at the media outlet at Planksip. I was inspired by Steve's gentle but firm criticism on an article on banking, and I kind of thought to myself, I thought, it's time to change things up and put some editorial guidelines and some oversight on stuff that goes out. So thanks, Steve, for that.
Welcome. Yeah. When I saw loanable funds turning up there in the money multiplier, I thought, hang on a second, we need a bit of quality control here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We have people that kind of like open source, or like they can publish just what they want, and I don't scrutinize a lot of it. But I think it's about time to elevate the game.
Yeah. I mean, we're trying to get rid of myths rather than promulgate them. And unfortunately, that article had quite a few myths in them, especially the idea of the banks lend out deposits, which, I was looking at a few parts I was querulous about, and history of money starting off with barter. And, okay. And then they thought, hang on a second, I'm wasting my time reading this. And that's not what you want to do. There's enough neoclassical textbooks out there for people to waste their time with them without us, unfortunately, occasionally by accident, fueling that particular fire.
Right.
Oh,
I'd rather dump all the rain in Greece on them.
Yeah. Who was the guest that we had? Was it last week? And it was the island. His book had a picture of an island on it. Who was the guest that we had last week?
Was it Clint Bollinger, or was it Kerry King?
No, I think it was Clint.
I think it was Clint.
Yeah.
I was away at that time, courtesy of COVID. Yeah.
Right, and he actually reinforced the barter myth, and I tried to challenge him, but Steve was away. I tried to say I don't think it was. So I'd like to bring that when he comes back and we do get Steve in the room together, because I think he emphasized barter as an origin of economics.
I think he rejected Graeber. I'm not too sure. It's been we had go through so many topics here. I sometimes forget.
Yeah.
What we've talked about.
Yeah.
But anyways, let's bring on Mike Radziki.
Hey, yeah.
How you doing, Mike? Getting your mid-breakfast, are we, or mid-lunch? I never quite know what time it is.
We're having lunch here on the East Coast. Yeah.
I'll be joining you for dinner here in Budapest in a short while.
Yeah. No, all is well. Getting the students off the ground at school and getting to the ebb and flow of the term. And today I'm reinstalling TVs at my house, pulling wires and such, because we cut the cord from the giant conglomerate that was overcharging us for our cable, and we're going with Wi-Fi local internet and streaming. So I'm going to save a bunch of money.
Good on you.
Well, I'm getting nice. The task I'm required to do here in Budapest, which I must admit is not particularly onerous. 1 book and 2 blog posts, and I've started writing the book is supposed to be 30,000 words, which is a good length as well. And I've started writing that. I've got the first 2 chapters done, and as you can imagine, it's trashing neoclassicals, but getting ready for saying what economics should be. And so I'm calling it. We must get Blair Phipps in here so I can apologise to him. I'm entitling it. Rebuilding economics from the top down, which of course is stealing a line from his blog title.
Yeah, I saw that. Well, let's get into the core of today's conversation, and that is international economics. Steve, I'll get it kind of started off with you. You know, what makes a domestic economy either import or export products? What are the variables involved and those decisions being made in aggregate?
Well, there's 2 ways to answer that question. One is to say what economists believe, and the other to say what the real world is about. And I'm not quite certain where to start. I might start with the economists just because I'm having a bit of fun trashing them in general. So let's start with trashing them straight away here. And their argument is it's all about what they call comparative advantage. And that originated with David Ricardo back in the 1820s, I think, roughly. And Ricardo was arguing for the repeal of the Corn Laws. And thick-headed people, otherwise known as conventional economists, don't read Ricardo. They look at the little model that he built, but they don't actually read him in detail. And if you read Ricardo in detail, they actually had a class analysis behind why he was arguing for free trade. And that was that he pretty much divided the world into 3 social classes: capitalist, workers, and landlords. And he said that the high price of the Corn Laws meant that corn could only be purchased, corn, which I think actually meant wheat in his time, but corn was the term for the laws, could only be purchased from domestic landlords, and they would charge a higher price. And that because workers were given a subsistence wage, that meant that the wage that manufacturers, capitalists, had to pay to hire workers was high, so that the profit of the surplus being generated out of manufacturing and agriculture went to the landlords rather than to the capitalists, and the landlords would waste that on fripperies, on indulgent consumption and so on, which is a bit comical because to some extent Ricardo was himself a landlord, but he was also a trader, very, very complicated lifestyle. And so he wanted to abolish that and reduce the cost of subsistence food. And his idea was that the cost of the food dropped, there would be no change. The wage would fall as well in real terms, so the workers would still get enough to buy the same amount of corn, but that would mean that the landlords got less because they were now being competed with by foreign imports of corn, or imports from corn from Europe. And the surplus would go to the manufacturers instead, who would invest more, and those manufacturers would therefore, by investing, would postpone the inevitable arrival of what Ricardo saw as coming our way ultimately, the steady state. So he saw this as a class analysis. Now, what he did was what I call a classic shell and pea trick. If you know the old shell and pea trick game, you distract you get a customer or somebody you want to con, and you move the shells around. They don't see where the ball is, and they pick the wrong one, and you pick their pockets. And I actually wrote a satire on that base with a cartoon book that I should actually put out again, called Econ Comics. But what he did was he talked about Portugal being able to produce both wine and cloth more efficiently than England could in terms of the number of workers required, and therefore said that if you make England produce only cloth and Portugal produce only wine, the actual physical amounts of both will increase, and we can trade the surplus and both countries benefit. But the Shell and Petrick side of it was it's moderately reasonable to talk about retraining shepherds as vignerons in Portugal and retraining grape pickers as sheep herders in England. But how do you turn a wine press into a spinning jenny? In other words, the capital is essential, the machinery, and he left it out of his argument. But it was such a clever argument that really became the whole foundation of economic theory: increase the efficiency with which we get production out of existing resources by shuffling products from one industry to another. And that became the mindset of the whole neoclassical world. So that's the way that they see things happening. In the real world, the large part of production begins because you simply can't, importing occurs because you can't produce the thing yourself locally. And it's therefore the absence of the capacity to produce something, which is initially a starting point. But then as we've progressed over time, we also have rival competitive developments of different technologies. And it may be that like an innovator in somewhere like, for example, Italy, might invent something like, for say, a scooter, and the scooter then becomes a product which could be made around the rest of the world, but currently isn't. And then the scooter manufacturer establishes and takes over a market. And then ultimately, at some point, some domestic competitor comes back with their variation on a scooter, and we then have competition between different specialized producers over time. So I see I don't at all swallow the neoclassical argument about comparative advantage. That's just nonsense. And to me, the main driver has been what I'm trying to remember the author's name. The Michael Porter, The Competitive Advantage of Nations. And what he found was that the types of specializations that we see in different countries really reflected very localized competition between capitalists in some particular region that led to innovations that outdid the rest of the world and made that area a dominant exporter of those products. And one of his examples was fast cars. And Lamborghini, Ferrari, Maserati, and I've forgotten the other, were all apparently originally tractor manufacturers. And then some kid in the family decided to make a fast tractor, which became a fast car. And then they were selling to the wealthy segments of that part of the world, producing faster and faster vehicles. And ultimately, you've got a competitive advantage, not a comparative advantage, but a competitive advantage for Italy in producing fast cars. So that's a very long-winded answer. But I think what it comes down to is, first of all, initial capacity to produce something, and then the competitive pressures in one part of the world can give one country an export advantage in that product over others. And now, of course, we've got multinationals who are really relocating production to take advantage of cheap wages and calling it comparative advantage. So I think there's too much international trade, and I think a large part of it has to go backwards, certainly as climate change starts hitting us, because a major contributor to the damage we're doing to the climate is international shipping. And at some point, we're going to be forced to relocate and produce domestically. And the main thing, I want to end on some sort of an analytic note. I think the whole focus on trade in economics is a furphy. It's misled us. The real thing that gives you growth whenever you want growth, or technological development when you want that, is an investment. And so it's distracted us from the important role of investment to focus upon the idea of reallocating existing resources more efficiently, when it's, pardon me, only one of your special words here, fucking impossible in the first place to reallocate resources from one point to another. Final theoretical point I'll make is the definition of economics that all these idiots have swallowed from Lionel Robbins in the 1930s, talked about the allocation of scarce resources between different, to allocate to unlimited wants, the scarce resources which have alternative uses, quote unquote. That's in the definition. Now, you find me an alternative use for a blast furnace.
Well said. I pretty much agree with everything, especially ultimately it's the productive capacity of the economy to produce its own stuff that's really going to be the main driver if an economy needs to actually import. So that was, I agree. Mike, can you add on your 2 bits here, because I know you got something to say.
I've got to get dinner.
Oh, he's got food. Steve's got food.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to just say, in 3 sentences or something, what is international economics? What are the important factors? There's so many different aspects to it. A lot of it is strategic planning at the state level, the government level. Is the nation pursuing an export strategy like China has for a long time? They have people coming out of the rural areas to the cities, and they've got to employ them somehow. So what do? You make stuff for everybody else, right? And that requires, manipulating your exchange rate, because, manufacturers in, let's say, the United States will find lower cost producers, right? But it has to be lower cost, including transportation costs and all that stuff. So there's certainly, that aspect to it, or, protecting infant industries, protecting strategic industries. Do you really want your adversary producing the parts for your fighter planes? Stuff like that. There's issues with, it's less now, but unions and protecting jobs. And, the United Steelworkers might have something to say about steel being imported from outside the United States, right? When they're steel workers. So all of these factors go into it, as well as the intertanglement of interest rates and exchange rates, right? So, if we swing over to modern monetary theory for a moment, if you have a sovereign nation with sovereign fiat currency, the central bank primarily sets interest rates, right? That's what they do. And when interest rates go higher, right? Money managers around the world buy, let's say if it's in the U.S. interest-bearing assets, right? So they need dollars, and that strengthens the dollar and hurts exports, right? And so on and so forth. So there's so many different intertwined factors that it's very hard to just say, oh, it's this, here's the list of things. Lastly, when the students ask me about this, I'll often say that any question in economics can be answered with "it depends," and it really does. If through international trade I can pick something, French wine, because I like it, instead of California wine, that's good for me, the consumer, right? And to the extent that economics is about meeting human wants, I want French wine in my example. But the California wine growers are not going to be real happy about that, right? Because, so who wins? Do you worry about the consumer getting Swiss chocolate and, French wine and German-made machine tools, or do you care about the domestic producers? So who wins? What's good? It depends.
Well said. Daniel, your thoughts?
We've opened up a big topic with a lot of information. I from Steve and also from Mike. I think the only thing I would add is that I see this as not so much a dichotomy, but I think that individuals want to be consumers rather than producers. And, like Steve said something about the you bring in exports when you no longer can produce them domestically. And but I think what happens is that you lose skill base, you can decimate. Like Canada is a perfect example in the softwood lumber industry. It takes a long time to get the momentum and the inertia. or it takes to get the momentum of an industry going. And there's ways to sabotage these things. There's ways to decimate industries. Now, in terms of an agency or an individual, I think people want to move towards, they want to be miners. Mine, right? They want to be consumers. I think that there's a psychological drive for humans around the world to be able to move into more and more consumption, and it's a vicious feedback cycle. So that's kind of where I look at it as. And do I really answer the question about what is import export? There's something really fundamentally good in import export between nations and market that I think is worth protecting, that I don't even know if we've fully been able to quantify or explain. Markets are an incredible societal mechanism for cultural exchange and enrichment of populations, both metaphysically and physically. So that's where I would summarize.
Certainly got an ambivalent feeling about the issue as well, because, like, for example, when I'm eating right now, I'm eating Thai food in Budapest, and having been raised as an Australian kid in the 50s, and the most exciting meal I could have was to go to what's called a Kale's restaurant, where I think there were 4 of them in Sydney. I think with one was American Longhorn style restaurant, and Italian pizza knockoff, etc., etc. And my ambition at that stage, like I was 18, was to eat a full Pizza Hut pizza myself. And now it is just such a ludicrous variety and range and complexity of food in Sydney and Melbourne in particular, that the culture has been enriched by the whole process, but that's migration rather than just international trade. But of course, with that goes, you've got to buy the products, you buy the inputs. So we benefit from what is feasible in one part of the world and into another, and that can enrich the whole human experience. Yes, that's right, Ghost in the Half Shell Pizza Hut. I'm embarrassed to say. In fact, at that stage, the Pizza Hut restaurant was, I'd say, 600 metres from Sydney Harbour and 500 metres from the main shopping drag in Sydney. And these days, you won't find more than 20 kilometres of the heart of Sydney because their food is so bloody boring compared to what the genuine Italian pizzas that we now have produced locally by Italian migrants actually offer. But yeah, there is that part of enriching the range of activities, but there's the danger, and this is where we're going to have some conflict with people who are advocate MMT rather less critically than I'd like them to do, is that the argument that exports are a cost and imports are a benefit. And I think that is one thing I'm not going to, I normally don't bother attacking it because I support the other monetary side of MMT's analysis. But the argument that it's good to actually deindustrialize flows out of that logic. And I think a huge part of the reason with the rise of Trump and the deplorables, et cetera, is the shipping of jobs overseas and the deindustrialization of America, the de-skilling of America. And at the same time, China's upskilled dramatically. And so in that particular case, the winner has been the one going for export-oriented growth, and the loser has been the one importing the goods from overseas. So, it's a very challenging area.
Do you think the U.S. dollar being the reserve currency gives America a little bit of an advantage in behaving that way economically versus other countries that don't have a reserve currency?
An advantage and a disadvantage. Because the advantage, they can get away with it. They're never going to run out of American dollars for international trade because they produce American dollars. And that's where the idea we send them a ship a piece of paper and get physical goods back, and it's our advantage to do that. That's where the part of that logic comes from. Because you only do it because you are the international reserve currency. Any other country that does the same thing runs a trade deficit, and they need to import capital goods from the first. If you've got a third world country needing to establish its own productive capabilities, and it's got to import foreign capital goods, it's got to pay US dollars for that. And if it is running a trade deficit, it can't do the importing with its own, it can't issue bonds in its own currency to raise that money. It's got to issue them in US dollars. And suddenly you're trapped in the clutches of the American financial system, which is not good for them. It's rather not even good for the American financial system in the long run, but it's damn good in the short term. So I think it's a very destructive and dangerous element of international trade.
AJ, welcome to the show. Thanks for subscribing. We hope we see you every week because we're always here. I'm going to get the list done. Mike, you're going to do the list this week because you haven't done it in about a month. So, Mike, top chatters, top commenters from last week. Here you go.
Oh, and it's skewed to the right. Look at that. So Michael De Souza Cruz and Web Freaks, Snert Rich, Ghost on the Half Shell, WWN0104, TSC Tempest, Bob Liori, Data Liori de la Terra, M, Sherry Wise, Tomas Serdes, not sure about that one. Dragai, ooh, that one too. Bosch Mandela, James or James Squared, I guess. Jesus, the Minstrel 55, Andrew Sullivan, TR, William Turner, BWN, SPTV, Brown Spa TVs, I don't know. Cobb Fan, the Atheist Paladin, Stephen Hinton, Benjamin Newland, Larimer, and Mighty Drunken.
Mike, what happened? Mike, you take a few weeks off, and it's like
I don't know.
What happened?
You're a bit rusty. You're a bit rusty there, Mike.
A few weeks off.
Oh,
the initials are challenging.
Our views were like going down as you were. Mike.
Maybe I should not. I'm overthinking it. I should just.
No. He's trying to get out. See, these academic types are really smart.
Mike, you've got a big put down here from WWE fan 0104. Mike reads this like a substitute teacher who doesn't know any of this.
Shots fired.
Having been a substitute teacher on occasions in my school teaching days, I know what that's savage.
Yes.
That's actually kind of good.
It's okay, Mike. That's why I never read the list.
I know.
Well, you know what? I've got a model. I guess I'm going to show it. I'll present it. I wasn't planning on doing it. I'm going to bring it up. Daniel, talk for a few minutes here and as I cue this up.
I'm excited about Mike's flight simulator. I don't know if we're going to have time to look at it, but it's a game. And one of the first things that Mike explained to us, and I think his vision for the future of disseminating complex information, especially related to economics, was to gamify it. So I see a link on our side. I don't know what we're going to do with it. I'm going to create a little tension, and I'm going to say that we might be able to incorporate it in a future episode, but I think it's pretty cool. Congrats, Mike. Turn it into a flight simulator. Do you want to explain what this flight simulator is and what it does?
Yeah, real quick. There was a model that appeared in the new Palgrave, which is sort of an encyclopedia of everything economics. And so what the editors would do is go around the world and pick economists who are experts in some piece of economics and say, write an encyclopedia entry for that econ thing. And so an economist named Don Harris, who's retired now, but he was at Stanford. He has a very famous daughter, Kamala Harris, Vice President of the United States.
Right. Okay.
And Don produced a model of a Smith-Ricardo Malthus model that looked at their vision of the growth of the English economy, resulting, as Steve said, in a steady state. And it embodies some of well-known Ricardian stuff like the law of diminishing marginal productivity in agriculture. As you use the best land first, and then as the economy grows, as the population grows, you use the next best land and so forth, and your output increases at a decreasing rate until you hit the water's edge, and that's kind of it. And Don divided the produce of the corn. It went to the workers, the subsistence wage, as Steve said, the capitalists, and the landowners, the aristocrats, who use their money for riotous living, quote unquote, whereas the workers consumed their wages, their corn, and the capitalists reinvested their corn to grow the system. And you get the S-shaped growth into the steady state. Basically, as the productivity starts waning, the output still goes to the landlords. The aristocrats win, and the capitalists suffer till at the end there's no profits, and so everything comes to a halt. And you can play around with it a little bit, but what I did was in the new Palgrave, it's just the traditional equations. And I translated it all into a system dynamics model, and you can play around with it and change the assumptions and stuff like that. So it mainly just explain that model to the students.
I'd love to have you do a live demonstration at some point. In some
Daniel, I'm going to do a live demonstration
now.
Yes, no, at some point later on. Not today, even. I just.
Who said it in the chat there? Don't leave Dan on the spot. I think it was Ghost on the Half Show. I'm sorry I left you on the spot, Dan. Okay, I'm gonna. I didn't plan to present this. I don't like showing unfinished models. But for anybody not familiar with Minsky, its main feature is its godly tables. So it follows accounting rules. A minus L minus E will always equal 0. I can see I've got a balancing issue right there, but that's not a big deal. So I started this model basically starting from godly tables and then expanded them as I went. So in this model, the godly tables are representing dollars. That's all I have. So on the top row, can everybody see my mouse highlighting things? Okay. So on the top row, these are your stocks in system dynamics. You have levels or stocks. And then along the side are your flows. So this represents the treasury balance sheet. And I want to stress to everybody that this is an aggregated macro model. So I'm not going to have every account that the treasury holds and subdivides. I've aggregated everything. So our first account is government deficits, or government deposits, and that's the TGA. If you're down in the States, the Treasury General Account. I have treasury bonds that banks hold, treasury bonds that the central bank holds, and treasury bonds that the foreign market holds. So I'll probably expand it in the future where the private sector, non-bank private sector will hold bonds as well. I have some of the government operations. Obviously, government spending will decrease the government account. Taxation will increase it. Interest on bonds will decrease it. Bonds maturing will decrease it. Open market operations is from the Treasury's perspective is a simple liability swap. So basically on the Treasury balance sheet, you can see the swaps of the bonds between the other agents, et cetera, et cetera. I'll scroll down here. We'll go into the central bank. A lot of these flows are the same as the Treasury. So up above the Treasury account, I call them government.
Excuse me, Ty. Can you just move it slightly to the right? You're missing, at least in my screen.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. That's a
better. Thank you.
restream thing. Yeah, okay. So the central bank, what Minsky does is if you have an asset stock, it's got to be a liability somewhere else in the system. So you'll see here, the government account is a liability to the central bank. Whereas for the treasury, if I go back up, is an asset. And this is something Minsky really sets up automatically for you. Once you create an asset or liability stock, it'll have a drop-down menu in your next godly table in the opposite asset class saying, okay, you've got to assign this. So this is your central bank, some basic operations here. As you can see in a domestic economy, the central bank is the bank for banks and the government. This settlement balances here, these are the accounts that the commercial banks hold. With the central bank, obviously it is aggregated. You can see government spending decreases the government account and increases settlement balances in the banking sector. And we can go down through them. And you'll see that a lot of the government operations have a corresponding flow in the settlement balances. We go down the commercial banks. I don't know if Steve does it this way, but when I'm building with these godly tables, I found it's easiest to start with commercial banks because commercial banks are not only connected to us, the private citizen, they're connected to the central bank, which is connected to the treasury. And I find it's kind of, instead of just horizontal and vertical money, I think of it almost as a triangle. And two triangles pointed on top of each other. So the bank is in the center, and then firms are down below in one corner, households are in the other corner, and then above you've got the central bank in one corner and the treasury in one corner.
If I can interrupt you there, Ty, that is precisely how I came to design godly tables in the first place. A bit of background for you, because I was trying to model money creation way back in the late 90s when I was working in differential equations. And I spent time working with Wynne Godley in 2000. And so I saw how Wynne did his stock flow consistent modeling. I had a couple of issues with it, but I thought the basic idea was very sound. And then in trying to model it, I read Graziani. And Graziani's paper, The Monetary Theory of Production, talked about how transactions in a monetary economy are triangular. You have a buyer, a seller, and a bank, which settles the accounts between the buyer and the seller. And then above the banks, you have one bank, another bank, and the central bank that settles between them, and then the treasury. So your intuition there is precisely how godly tables came to be.
Right. Yeah. It's for me, it's just a way I visualize it. And so anyways, that's how it comes about. The godly table for the banking sector is obviously the biggest. We've got loans to firms. We have discounts. So these are assets here for the banking sector right up to this double line. So we've got loans to firms. We've got discount or domestic loans. No, this is a DA is an account at corresponding banks. For a lot of people to understand how international banking works, we use the SWIFT network, and it's a network of banks that hold accounts with each other. Central banks are not involved with it. So this DA is an account with a corresponding bank. Obviously, settlement balances are the accounts that banks hold at the central bank. We have loans to households. We have bank capital that can be interpreted as physical bank branches or the computers or the desks inside of those banks. We have treasury bonds that the banks hold. And then we have foreign bonds that the banks hold from other countries. And if I scroll over here a little bit, then we have the liabilities for the banking sector, which is obviously firm deposits, household deposits, discount window loans. So if the banking sector is short on settlement balances, and of course down in the States, any of our American viewers are watching, they call them reserves down there, but I'll call them settlement balances here. And then we have loans. This is a liability from corresponding banks. Corresponding banks will loan funds to local banks for international transactions. It's basically a reserve. Then you have your financial bank equity, and then you have your real bank equity. I'll scroll down. I'll just try to go through all the godly tables just to give you an aggregated idea. Then we have firms, much of the same. So a firm bank account, FD, is an asset over here, whereas in the banking system, like I said before, it is a corresponding liability. And these are all the operations in the model that the firm sector does. Paying workers, firms invest, household consumption, obviously that'll increase the firm deposit account, credit to the firms, depreciation of firms' real assets, interest that the firms pay on loans, firm output. This model, I track inventory, which is very important. Steve was talking about what an economy produces and what it doesn't produce. If the inventory starts going down, the economy starts importing goods from abroad. We'll go down. The next one is households. Pretty small. I'll probably do a little bit more, but the one thing I really want to include in households was housing and credit for the household sector, because I think that has some pretty important dynamics in our modern economy. So that has been included in it. I'll show later that I actually have different age demographics for the model. So there is an old age pension in this model, just showing the effects of, the government spending directly on households versus the firms. And then the final godly table, and this was my unique way to address this is a domestic economic model with elements from the global system. And I needed a way to tie into the foreign sector without modeling, every other economy on the planet. My best option for that was to go as far as corresponding banks. Those are big international banks, like Bank of America is a big corresponding bank in the world. Many small local banks, both foreign and domestic, hold accounts with them. And that's how we mark up and mark down accounts doing international transactions, generally, mostly in US dollars. It just makes it a little bit easier. I'll go to the dynamics of the model. It's going to be hard for me to explain because I haven't even documented half of this stuff. For a lot of people that watch Steve, they're going to recognize his model, the Minsky financial instability hypothesis model, where he basically took the Goodwin growth cycle model and applied a financial sector to it. I guess I'll start from capital over here. So this part will probably look familiar to some people. You have real capital, and you have energy as an input. That's going to give you an output Q of megajoules of energy, which is going to give you your real output. Real output by labor divided by labor productivity gives you your labor. Let's zoom in a little bit more here. Don't have a lot of documentation, so this is going to be kind of hard. Basically, that's fed into a kind of Phillips curve. So as labor goes up, it puts pressure on the wage level to go up. The wage level times the amount of laborers is going to give you your wage bill. Your wage bill is going to be subtracted from profits from the firm, et cetera, et cetera. It does that loop, and then some of the profits is invested into capital. There's that traditional loop in the model. I've added, at this point, government spending has a couple functions because I believe, Well, it's just a true fact. When the government is spending now, we are spending more intensively as a government than we did in the past. So I needed two slopes, two functions for that to kind of simulate. And we're seeing it with COVID now. I can even do an experiment with COVID here because I do track capital utilization. But right now, very exogenous. I have kind of a political system here where, the government starts spending in 1965, goes into austerity in 1980, back into spending in 1990, austerity 2000, et cetera, et cetera. I might do something endogenous there, but it might be a little bit difficult to figure out that behavior based on the stocks that I currently have in the model. But that has a huge effect on investment and inflation in this model. There's obviously a small little subroutine for investment. And basically, this again goes back to Steve's work and the whole Minskyan hypothesis. As the firm sector earns more and more profit, they tend to take out more and more credit to invest more and more. Obviously, some of that investment can be malinvestment and not very productive. And then, of course, the firm sector has rising debt levels, interest rates go up, and you have some instability develop in the system. Then I have, the functions for the bond market and the foreign bond market. I haven't quite laid this out the way I want to in a proper flow chart to really give a logical view, but we have open market operations here based on the amount of settlement balances there are. The banking sector needs a certain amount of settlement balances for banks to settle overnight, depending on the size of the economy. So I just created a little ratio right now, and I'm saying that, economic activity, the settlement balances have to be 10% of that. That is an assumption I made on my part. I didn't look at the data. It's just to keep the model, upright. I could probably adjust that in the future if I find data. And I want to say this model is not a predictive model. This is a pedagogical model. This is a tool to teach somebody how the economy works. If interest rates go up, generally, what are the qualitative effects in other parts of the economy? It by no means is set up to say, okay, 10 years from now, the American economy is going to be at, $25 trillion or whatever. It's not designed like that. It's designed as a teaching tool and to observe feedback loops in the model. So I've employed a lot of assumptions on ratios and whatnot. My goal is to get the feedback loops correct. So that's kind of the economic part of it. We have a pricing right now. I have plans for prices to. This is what Steve did in a model I found a few years ago, as he uses the wage share as a tool to decide what the price level is. And what's ingenious about it is the wage share here is showing what output is in relation to the wage bill in the economy. So that both covers not only rising wages, but also covers the level of output in the economy. So it's kind of two birds with one stone. But I do now have the value on the domestic currency. So that's going to come into play. I haven't designed it yet, but anything that the economy imports, it's going to have a markup in prices based on the value of its currency internationally. So there's going to be some different dynamics there. And inflation, being on Twitter, there's so many goddamn theories for inflation. Really, I don't think there is one such thing. I have been actually reading the Austrian theory right now, the subjective value theory, and there is, to me, some validity to it. It's not all of it, but what strikes me as important with inflation is that every school, I think, gets a part of it right and a part of it wrong. And that's very hard for me to try to model that, because what is right and what is wrong. And if I just try to add everything, well, in a dynamic system, that is asking for problems. So I have, outside of the economic part, I have a climate system in here. I'm still developing it. Basically, the economy produces so many megajoules. I've converted that into gigatons of carbon going into the atmosphere. This obviously is going to give you what your parts per million of CO2 is in the atmosphere. It's going to, and this is the model here that I built, this climate model. I took from a paper from the University of Texas, essentially, and augmented it a little bit so I can make it into a system dynamic model. So it has 3 system states in this part of the model. You have your atmospheric energy, your Earth's energy, and your atmospheric CO2. So there's a lot of interplay from that. We have exogenous kind of parts here. So solar radiation. My model has nothing to do with that, but it is modeled in there to make this little climate model run. And of course, all of that is fed into an equation to determine absolute temperature at the surface level on the planet. That's very important because in the larger part of the model, I have that affecting population dynamics. And I will be adding more to this, but as the temperature goes up, that is going to affect the life expectancy of humans. And I just picked an arbitrary number, and I made a little lookup table for that. By no means is it scientific. I could probably dial it into a scientific level if there are any papers out there correlating temperature to life expectancy, which I'm sure there is. But that feeds into that. And then I have a small biosphere model, which is basically a third order predator prey model. Basically, we have carnivores, herbivores, and then plant life in this model. And it feeds back into the human population part of the model. Very complex. I'll zoom out. That's kind of where it stands everywhere. There's so much I could go through, but it would take a couple hours. I'll run the model before I turn the screen off here, just so everybody can see the dynamics. I have to go to our origin level and our plots. And I know some of this will be cut off on the screen. I'll see if I can move it over a bit. And we'll just run the model. And I think I'm headed in the right direction. It shows the business cycle. It shows the population dynamics. It shows, how energy reserves are going to affect the way we grow. And in this model too, energy, the nation that I have, this hypothetical nation, does not produce its own energy. It comes from the foreign sector, where its resources, so like trees, minerals, at this point all come from the domestic sector itself. I will expand that later, where once those resources dwindle, the domestic economy will have to go to the foreign sector for those resources. And obviously that'll introduce dynamics depending on the value of the currency at the time those imports occur. Basically, that's the model at this point. I will stop sharing. Turn that off. See if people are still here. I'm still here.
That's a remarkable
There you
piece
go.
of work, Simon. We've got to take. Well, I haven't my hat on, but I'll take it off to you anyway. Mike, have you seen any models that approach that in complexity in other languages?
You mean in system dynamics?
Mm.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
So for example, John Sturman has a model of the energy transition for the U.S. economy. It's spanned 4 thick volumes for his doctoral dissertation. It's the longest dissertation I've ever seen.
Oh my God! Wow. Okay.
There's Jerry Barney passed away. He was a physicist, but he worked for Jimmy Carter as in the late 70s as kind of his sustainability czar. Didn't call it that back then. And when Carter lost to Reagan, Jerry started an organization called the Millennium Institute and selected system dynamics as its tool. And they have a very large scale socioeconomic environment healthcare model that they go around the world tuning up to various countries to fit their particular situation and doing policy analysis. Toru Yamaguchi in Japan. You know Toru, very large scale model he's worked on for decades.
Trouble is, he had exogenous money in it, which was extremely hard for him to change. That's one reason that godly tables are dramatically better than the flowchart. If you wanted to refine from one type of nature of monetary system to another, it's very easy to do. Whereas the redesign a flowchart model, I think, is a nightmare.
Yeah, I've got a model I work on periodically when I have free time called Gompi. Gompi's the WPM mascot. So there's a bunch of these model. You know, there's Jay Forrester's socioeconomic model that he's passed away, of course, but it's there. And the question is, will his disciples publish it or not? The people who have it that he gave it to on his deathbed are trying to decipher what he writes dense equations. So there's a bunch of these that are out there, very large scale like that. And as Ty is sort of conveying its tricky business to build one of these things and keep everything straight so you don't have mayhem going on, modeling mayhem. So it requires tremendous discipline to build a large scale, nonlinear complex systems model. Otherwise, nobody understands it. It's out of control. You can't find the errors, the whole 9 yards. So it's really
and that's one thing which we're trying to address in designing Minsky. So like the godly table will tell you if you're making errors in your financial system, and that's the great advantage I think Minsky has over any other program. But the flowchart side of things has still got the same basic potential system of errors. If you leave out a causal loop, or if you don't have a particular factor in your model, then you're going to be, if that's part of the real world, then you're going to be wrong no matter how well designed your model is. So they're but the hard thing is actually communicating it, and that's what that's again one reason with to get away from the spaghetti code problem of standard programs. We have what I think, Ty, you could call it a spider web, wouldn't you, with Minsky?
A spider web program. And I think what it could really use is Vincem has it. It's called a causes tree and a uses tree. And if that was
has that too.
If that I think Minsky really, for a model like this, and tracking the feedback loops. I have to manually write down the feedback loops because Minsky doesn't do that. Which is an exercise in itself. So I know right now Russell's working on the I guess we're calling it a Phillips diagram. I don't think we need to achieve something like other system dynamic programs. I just think we need to have the ability to click on a tab and it'll show you all the feedback loops. And then have what's called a use tree. So what the variable uses, and a causes tree. What does the variable cause? And it's very much like Minsky in the wiring diagram, where you kind of go down into a tree. Versus the circular Forrester type stock flow diagram. So I think it would actually be very intuitive for Minsky to have that and just steal it from Vincem.
So trying to manually identify feedback loops and even a modest scale model is very difficult. And when the software solution reveals the loops, you're almost always 99.9% of the time surprised, because you can't find them all manually. And then if you have a large scale model, it's out of control. You need a software solution to identify
what
loops.
My solution was I have about 87 versions built up. So I kept track. I knew right away because this is kind of the fourth version of the model in a year. So at the start of this fourth version, I decided, okay, I'm going to track all my equations and all my loops from each iteration. And that's how I kept track of it. If I were to try to do that manually with the model I just showed, I'd for one quit system dynamics. I'd say fuck Minsky, fuck economics, fuck this live stream. I'm out of here. I'm going to go live in a cave. So what I did to avoid that is literally I have each iteration of this model from the start. I was actually going to think about making a video, just watching the model expand like a time.
That's probably a very good idea, Ty, because I mean the thing we're trying to do with system dynamics is not just model the actual dynamics rather than the fantasy of equilibrium that Pascal's impose on everything. Actually have the live dynamics, and we've got that great advantage. We actually do show those in Minsky. But yeah, it's learning how the model expands over time. And like I look at that model and I'm swamped. It includes a lot of components of my own thoughts, but put together in such a way that I get overwhelmed by the interconnections. So if you go this level, then the next one, then the next one, then the next one, like from going from the inside an onion out to the whole scale, that would be a fabulous learning tool.
Yeah, for sure. I'd love once, maybe if the grouping is refined a little bit more and we can nest inside. Right now, if you try to nest a group in Minsky, it gets offset. Variables pop out. But I would love, because you know how I'm pretty intrigued by just the layout and design in Minsky. I'd love to nest the different subsystems so you could drill right down. And like I said in my tweet, or it might have been on one of my podcasts, go right down to the nucleus of the economic model, which is the Goodwin growth cycle model. I love that model. It's got to be my favorite model of all time. It's simple, but for me, it explains Marx. It explains mathematics. It explains system dynamics all in one, and it explains the business cycle to me. It is the top of the hour. I want to cover some news, some international news. We kind of touched on it, so we're going to do that next. Mike, are you going to actually stay for the rest of this show, or are you going to disappear between the cutscene here?
I'll stay.
Oh, you'll stay? Okay.
Yeah, last week I had a family thing.
So I found this news story. I thought it was pretty interesting. I'll read it here for you guys if I can bring it up in front of me. China's exports have fallen 8.8% in August compared to a year earlier. Well, the new report by the U.S. Census Bureau showed that China's share of U.S. good imports fell to the lowest level since 2006. The share of imported goods from China was 14.6% over that period. That is down from a peak of 21.8%. And that was before the period of Donald Trump's tariffs that he put on his own people. I don't really care about the news story specifically, but I am seeing this might be the rise of the middle class in China, but we are seeing that China's ability as the factory of the world is slipping a little bit. By no means are they out of the game. They're still the world's factory. What's causing the dynamics of that? I'll ask Steve first.
I was actually going to try to pull up my Ravel database on this front, but I didn't quite get there in the time of the introduction. I've seen a lot of reports about slowdown in China. I think there's a whole lot of causes behind it. One of the main ones is the way that they jumped over the crisis caused by the global financial crisis. When the GFC hit, I think from memory, China's exports fell by 46%, which is an incredible plunge. And the response of the Chinese government at the time was to basically tell the banking system, which of course is pretty much under state control. They're not actually state-owned banks, but they're state-directed and dominated banks, and they're, in that sense, they're also backed by a lot of the banks are backed by the state, so they're not particularly afraid of going bankrupt. Basically told them to lend to anybody with a pulse. And you had an enormous increase in private debt. So in 1 year, and I do know this figure from my own data, China's private debt level rose by 40% of GDP in 1 year. Now that's about 3 times as fast as debt rose in Japan during its bubble economy days from 1980 to 1990. So the incredible expansion in credit-based demand, and that's what meant that China, rather than falling into a slump because of the GFC, had an enormous domestically financed credit-based demand. But what that also meant was most of it went into building housing. And I had literally been inside an ex-girlfriend's apartment, which she bought as an investment in, I think it was a set of 6 30-story towers built just outside a third-tier city called Dayang in Sichuan province. And to get to her apartment, we had to bang on the, I'm not joking, we had to bang on the stainless steel of the lift shaft so that the woman operating the lift would come down and open the door for us and take us up to her level. We walked into bare concrete, which was basically the whole floor of her apartment had not yet been finished. And this was just all over China with all the ghost towers and so on. Now, that was basically a huge Ponzi scheme. And it worked in various ways through state, the provincial governments. Because what the provincial governments would, on the periphery to one of these development processes, get money for its own domestic production. And a lot of that would actually go into genuine manufacturing investment and so on. But then the people buying the land would then put huge towers up. People would borrow money from the banks to buy the towers, and you had a huge Ponzi scheme. So this is now unraveling, and that people are probably finding it impossible to service their debts, which may be a large reason why they're not importing as much. The export fall, that's the intriguing one, getting both at the same time. And that implies potentially difficulties with global demand as well. So that one I'm not sure about. We've had that is quite a substantial fall as you're showing there. That's exports and imports. That's the change in
the change.
Yeah.
Year over year change.
Yeah. So 30% up, going up by 30%, down by 15%. So that implies to me that we may be getting a slowdown in the global economy as well, coming largely out of the impact of higher government interest rates. Not that Warren Mosler makes the good point that those higher rates mean more money for people who buy bonds off the government when they're buying new bonds. What it also does, and I don't think this has been taken properly into account, it devalues the bonds they currently have. So we have an incredibly fragile financial system at the moment. But with those higher interest rates, nobody is building new housing. Nobody's borrowing to put domestic machinery inside their houses and so on. And we may well be having a credit-based slowdown caused by those high interest rates finally, carking the global economy.
Mike, what's your thoughts?
Well, I'm by no means an expert in the Chinese economy, but I do know a big elephant in the room is, as Steve is kind of alluding to, is the real estate bubble that's unwinding. That's kind of what happened in 2008 in the United States. There's tensions, global tensions with China. So I don't know what technology restrictions there are affecting productivity. Their demographics, including labor force participation and all that is in the cities and what have you, I think is a factor. And it's all kind of happening simultaneously. As Steve kind of said, you have both the import and the import and export side having trouble simultaneously, which is kind of curious. And it does beg the question, does it not bode well for the world economy? They always used to say the U.S. was the economy was the locomotive that pulled the world economy, but China is no slouch. And, if they're slowing and having trouble, what implications does that have globally remains to be seen.
So we got a question here from Mike, off topic. I'll bring it up here. Or pardon me, from Tony Wilson. I guess maybe to Mike, but I'm sure Steve can answer. Finite elements methods are the basis of how we analyze structures and the dynamics of structures. It's also the basis of computational fluid dynamics. Who wants to start on that? I'll start with Mike.
Well, I did respond in the chat that I hear the engineers babbling about that from time to time at WPI, but I don't really know what it is. Now I know a little bit more, thanks to Tony. Yeah, there are other numerical simulation techniques besides system dynamics, whether we're using Stellar, Minsky, or Vensim, or what have you. Economists, I must say, are a weird bunch in the sense that if a tool is not invented by them, they don't want to use it. Or it's like pulling teeth to get them to even take a look at it. Other disciplines like physics, I'm not a physicist, but my understanding is that, hey, if something from somewhere else works, we use it. It's not a big deal. But economists seem to have this, aversion to going outside the tribe for tools. And, engineers and scientists have other tools. Maybe we should look there,
Yeah, I mean, that's the economists trash system dynamics in the very first instance, courtesy of Nordhaus. But like Mike, Tony, I've got some familiarity with finite element analysis from my days doing mathematics. And if I wanted to characterize it, correct me if I'm wrong here, fundamentally, what that enables you to do is to take into account space as well as time, and that you'll test the potential strength of a building against an earthquake by breaking a whole lot of finite elements, fundamentally triangles, and then stressing it, and the stress from one element will be passed to another because they're geographically linked to each other. When you do it for computational fluid dynamics, you divide the world into cells, and of course air moving out of one cell has to move into another, so you get that regionalism there as well as time. And in a sense, if we wanted to properly model what we started talking about today, which is international trade, we should be using finite element analysis to analyze international trade. And that would mean what I would imagine doing, working from our basis in Minsky, is to do a time to replicate, to build up one model of one particular economy, the mesh, as James is saying there, and then replicate that as a structure where the different meshes are all interrelated through exports and imports and financial flows and so on. And you would then, what becomes complicated then is analyzing the overall process, because you've got an enormous number of different elements. And what are you trying to measure? What happens to one particular element or to the entire aggregation? When you use it for designing a plane, or designing a building for earthquake stresses or the global. Tony's saying sort of yes, in a way like seeing a structure like it's made out of Lego blocks. Yeah, but move one Lego, the Lego blocks are mobile in this particular case, or they can be stressed and make one move the other way. So I think that's an extremely useful thing we should be trying to extend into. And if you look at what we're doing with Minsky and what you do with Vensim and so on, we're fundamentally saying the economy is a single point, and that's not true. Okay, so the second best thing we can do, and this is what Ty's doing with his model, is say, well, there's one point which is one domestic economy and another point which is the rest of the world, and then what we do ultimately is expand that out, and so each sub-module would be a finite element linked to all the other finite elements through a far more sophisticated set of equations than we've shown in any of these system dynamics models.
I think it sounds, as I'm reading a little bit more from Tony, that it's akin to agent-based modeling, sort of a similar set of ideas where each finite element would be an agent in an agent-based model. And then we can get at tools like AnyLogic that allow you to build pure agent-based, pure discrete event, pure system dynamics, or hybrid models that contain all of those features presumably appropriately used to represent this, that, and the other.
Yeah, so Ghost on that box, or George Box, what did he always say? All models are wrong,
but some are used
sometimes, but some are useful.
Yeah. I think with a corollary, almost all economic models are useless or worse than useless. That's one of the great dangers. And what we're trying to do with system dynamics here is to at last start dragging economics out of the 19th century into at least the early 20th or the mid 20th. And frankly, they're still back in the late 19th century and they think they're sophisticated. So that's an enormously difficult task. And as a result, I mean, economists, if you look at what they learn, there's one of my favorite texts on this is called Macroeconomics with Python and Advanced Macroeconomics with Python, done by Sargent, I think it is, and one of the other neoclassical nerds. And the whole damn thing is full of difference equations. Okay. There's only 4 pages of differential equations in the whole bloody thing, and that's the differential equations used to explain the stability properties of the Hansen, Samuelson, Hicks second order difference equation for the trade cycle. And I know that's mathematically wrong, not mathematically, but economically, logically wrong. So the only time they use what is the basic tool is to explain a bad model. And then they think that difference equations are sophisticated. Grow up, kids. The real stuff is being done by physicists and by, as Tony was saying here, people using finite element analysis. It's way more sophisticated what economists do. They're wanking if they think they're in the same bloody classroom.
Yeah, I don't think during my little modeling exercise, I never referenced one economic model.
Good. Don't contaminate it.
What am I?
Keep yourself pure, mate. Keep yourself pure.
Yeah. I don't.
But Tony, look, this is just a request to Tony here. I think it'd be fascinating to have you come on and talk about it. So this is me a little bit making an invite to you. It's time we brought in some ideas from other disciplines. So if you're willing to come on and talk about that, give it a bit of feedback. We'd like to chat with you.
Yeah.
Wanking is a town in China.
Oh, I thought it was something I did as a teenager, but okay. I'm
tell you what.
Dan,
he's blushing. He's blushing.
Me?
It's either that or Canada's got extremely hot all of a sudden.
How do we go from wanking to like, okay, Dan's turn to talk, right? I mean,
like actually, I have to find an old photograph of me. It's my farewell party when I worked at a place called the Ideas Centre, which was a left-wing, third world-oriented library run by the Freedom from Hunger campaign in the 80s. Beat red tie, yeah. And my staff mates as a farewell just covered the whole place in sayings, and one of them was, I used to think what Wanking was a town in China until I discovered Smirnoff.
Oh shit! Yeah. Well, if there's one thing this live stream is that it's not dull and boring. I mean, like we certainly bring some flavor to it, right?
I'm going to see if I can find that photograph. Okay, keep chatting. Yeah.
So everybody, we've got some really good guests coming up over the next 2 months. We have a neoclassical economist next week. John Hearn is going to be on the show. You know, Steve's covering his face, but I know
oh my God,
they're actually
like I love John. I love him, but my God, that's going to be talk about discordant conversations. People, if you want to call in to see a real paradigm clashes, next week is the show.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And we're not done there. We're going to have an Austrian in about 3 weeks. One of the more famous and the Mrs. Austrian, so real right side. Bob Murphy is coming on the show, so that's going to be interesting as well. Warren Mosler didn't have time, so I thought I'd bring on his biggest rival. And you know what's actually shocking is Steve and Bob are going to agree on something, and that's Paul Krugman. So that'll be
I
interesting.
think
We've got
we
Anne.
can stamp on common ground. Okay.
Yeah, there is a common ground there. We've got Anne Pettifor will be on in about a month and a half. So a lot of different guests. We'll have some system dynamic guests. I'm gonna have some Mike's colleagues come on the show. They might be students or just colleagues. So we're gonna get into that part. So we got a lot of diverse guests coming up. Hopefully they show up. Daniel, I wanted to get you in on the conversation. I want you to read the top chatters from last week. Top chatters, top commenters. I'll bring it up. Here it is. Read away, buddy.
Michael D'Souza Cruz, N Web Freaks, Snert Rich, Ghost on a Half Shell, WWE Fan 0104, TC Tempest, Bob Liori, Data Lore de la Terra, M. Sherry Wise, Thomas Surges, Dregai, Botch Mandela, James Squared, Jesus, The Minstrel 55, Andrew Sullivan, TR, William Turner, BWN SPTV, Cobb Fan, The Atheist Paladin, Stefan Hinton, Benjamin Newland, Larimer, and the Mighty Drunken. What? Come on. Is it because I said Stephen instead of Stefan, or I said Stefan instead of Stephen? Oh,
I believe in equality. So I treat everybody equally, Dan.
Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. So
everybody sucks, yeah.
Everybody sucks. Steve, are you looking for something?
He's looking for
I can't hear him. Steve, I can't hear you.
I am. Can I share my screen?
You can share your screen. Bring it up on the side, and I'll
hang on a second. I'll have to see if I can find it. Get it right here. Window. That'll do. Can you see it?
Bring it up. Yeah, I can see a black screen.
Wait till it.
Maybe. There. Go back to it physically on your computer, or sometimes Restream does it.
Yeah.
So just go to the actual window itself and look at it. There we go. And let me just let's keep that up here. Let me shut down the chat window so we can all see this. And it's
what are you wearing?
Beautiful.
There's a real story behind that. That was my farewell from a place called the Ideas Center. It was shortly after the Vietnam War.
Wow.
And I decided I was going to wear a sort of Vietnamese, the Vietnamese they used to talk about the Vietnamese wearing pajamas as they were running up and down the tunnels fighting the Americans and the Australians in the Vietnam War. So I got I think I got a seamstress or my girlfriend to make me a silk, Chinese silk set of pajamas, which I then wore to my farewell at this Ideas Center. And as part of the laugh of it, this is an intriguing personal story. I had, just before I left the Freedom for Hunger campaign, we had Sir Peter Ustinov come to visit us. Long story as to why. Those who don't know him, he was a famous actor and a brilliant raconteur. And he turned up at my office and simply collapsed in shock in the chair in front of me. And I asked him what the hell's gone wrong, and I said, it's I said I've had a terrible taxi ride, and my thought was, he must have been driven at high speed from the airport to my office along a very narrow road, which was the only road to the airport in those days, and it would have been dangerous. Yes, Ustinov. And it wasn't that at all. He said, I sat down in the back seat of the cab, and the taxi driver took one look at me and saw that I was white, and launched into the most revolting racist diatribe I've ever heard in my life, talking about wogs and chinks and eye ties, and how he'd had owned apartments out west, and he'd go in and smash their television screens and stuff. This really fucking revolting human being. And Ustinov then said that, having just carried on like this as if Ustinov, because he was white, would agree with him, looked in the rear vision mirror and saw that Ustinov was horrified. And he finally snarled, and Ustinov took his voice off perfectly because, as anybody who knows Ustinov, who's a brilliant mimic as well as a brilliant wit, he could copy anybody's voice immediately. He said, I suppose you don't give a fuck what I think. I suppose you reckon all us Australians are descended from fucking convicts. And Ustinov replied, on the contrary, my dear man, I'm convinced you're descended from one of the warders, which I thought was both absolutely brilliant comeback, and it also became my way of thinking about Australian society. We have this, I'm obviously convict stock, but the warders take over the place and fuck it up completely on various occasions. So that became my picture of Australia. Anyway, long story for that. When I decided to go to work wearing this gear, there's no fucking way I was going to do it on public transport. So I called a taxi. I hopped in the back seat of the taxi, and the guy took one look at me in the mirror and saw that I was white and launched into the most revolting racist diatribe I'd ever heard in my life. It was the same asshole. I was in shock. I mean, the voice was Ustinov's voice speaking through this pig in the front seat of the cab. I sat in the back seat. The normal story for an Australian is sit next to the taxi driver. Well, again, wearing this gear, I wasn't going to do that, so I sat in the back seat. So he saw me through the rear vision mirror. Here I was, white, as you can see, with the beard. He couldn't see the clothing I was wearing. And he just went on, no, this is the same asshole. Absolutely the same fucking revolting human being. And he got me to the building when the office was said, thank you very much. You've reminded me why I worked here. And I got out wearing that gear and had a great party. So, there you go.
Nice story. Nice.
That was a great picture. How old were you, Steve?
Sorry, I was 27.
27 there.
Mm.
Oh, wow.
A long time ago.
Wow. Oh, yeah. How many years ago was that, Steve?
Don't ask me. 43 years. one year more than life, the universe, and everything.
Let's get back to some economics here. I've got another one here, another news story, and it pertains to UK house prices suffering its sharpest fall in 14 years. UK house prices have suffered their sharpest fall annual drop in 14 years as the seasonal summer slump and high mortgage costs dragged on sales. Data released by Halifax Mortgage Corporation, Britain's largest mortgage lender, showed that prices fell 4.6% in August, making the biggest year-on-year decrease since 2009. Is this kind of what your fears are with the rising interest rates, Steve?
Yeah, and it's actually taken me by surprise, I have to admit, because I thought that after the financial crisis, because the central banks really dived in to save the financial assets in the banks rather than the public, they were going to be beholden to asset prices permanently. And whenever they saw a tendency for asset prices to fall, they were likely to go back and drop interest rates again. Well, they've surprised me by being obsessed with the idea of returning the rate of inflation to 2% by putting up a non-functional control, the interest rate. And the only way that really works ultimately is by crushing credit demand. So it varies how effective it is in different countries. But if you have a country like America, where most mortgages are fixed rate, then the variations of the interest rate don't affect you directly, but it does affect new demand for housing. But a country like Australia in particular, and also I think in the case of the UK, there's a substantial number of floating rate mortgages. So when the rates go up, that immediately squeezes the capacity of households to buy. And then what that means is that some of them are going to be forced to sell. And so you get distressed selling. And you also get far less demand for housing in the first instance. So this is the central banks having pumped asset prices up through both QE and dropping the interest rate to zero. They're now stuck to their ludicrous bloody Taylor function models, and they're putting up interest rates to control inflation which doesn't work. Their models, the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, believe that when they put interest rates up, they change our consumption behavior because it's changing the time value of money for us infinitely lived households, and we therefore spend less now and we'll save more for the future. Absolute bullshit. But what it does do ultimately is mean that the banking sector can no longer get people to take on new loans. And a lot of the loans they do have start going bad because people can't service the debts. So you get a credit crunch. And, congratulations, central banks, being driven by neoclassical economists. You're fucking us over yet again.
I believe that they use the term, and it kind of smirches his name, but Euler's equation in economics has a convoluted relationship between consumption and interest rates that I still don't understand, and I don't think I could apply units to the equation because it wouldn't work.
We might drag on one of my old very good mates from Kingston University days, Devrim Yilmaz, on here. Devrim's now working for the French Development Agency and doing brilliant work. In fact, the only person I know builds models bigger than you, Ty, and he does it in straight differential equations in Mathematica. So he's one hell of a cookie. But he went to Manchester University to do his PhD way back in the 90s, I think. And the reason he went to Manchester was at that stage Manchester was dominated by what are called Schraffian economists, and he thought he'd learn Schraffian-style economics, input-out dynamics instead. In the meantime, the neoclassicals had purged all the Schraffians, so he's forced to write a DSGE model of his own economy. And he's the only person I've been with who can explain how a DSGE model is constructed, and knows it from having built it himself. So it'd be great to get him on here to explain where this garbage comes from.
Yeah, well, we'll try to organize it. Cody, you can watch. You don't have to watch this live. It's posted on the Prof. Steve Keen YouTube channel. If you have any comments or questions, you can put them in the comments underneath the video. If they're good questions, I'll relay them to Steve. So don't feel obligated if you've got family obligations to be here. You can watch it later. We get, last week, I think we got 1,300 views, 200 was live audience, and, 1,100 was people that watched it afterwards. So this show works out as just watching when you have time to. You'll still get all the information. And like I said, if you got questions, put them in the comments. Mike, can you add anything to the credit and housing issue in the UK?
Well, again, it's a complex system. A lot of things going on. There's the basics of supply and demand, of course, that influence housing prices. On the supply side, you can constrain housing with not only high interest rates, but also regulations. Some of the states like California in the U.S. make it so onerous to build new construction that it's held back, and you get imbalances in the markets, in the housing markets. I should say too, and I wanted to kind of tie this to our previous discussion of international economics, and tie it also to this notion of feedback loops, which are in all of our models, and that is the basic neoclassical or Econ 101 supply and demand relationship working through price are negative feedback loops, right?
Yeah.
Balancing loops, and in balance, it's equilibrium and what have you. But speculative bubbles, speculation, is a positive feedback process. You can have speculation in the housing market. You can have speculation in currency markets. And you kind of get into the whole Minsky thing, Hyman Minsky and his, Ponzi schemes and whatever. And I think that isn't really studied enough. I mean, you get irrational exuberance in some of these, every once in a while. The press talks about it, the Greenspan talked about it and what have you. But people like James Tobin were quite aware of the harm that can come from speculation, speculative bubbles, they're popping and whatever, and proposed a Tobin tax to try and, you got in a lot of markets, you have hedgers and speculators, and you want to get rid of or at least damp down the speculators because they can cause all sorts of mayhem. So those positive loops, when they get going, it can cause lots of bad things. And I'm not sure how much speculation is in the current housing situation in the UK and that data, but if it's not presently happening, it's a latent structure, we would say, in system dynamics that lies in waiting to be activated.
If I can just cover a bit more on the housing dynamics. One thing, haven't written this paper up. This is one of these accidents of time. Paul Homerin and Paul came to a presentation I gave for my inaugural speech at Kingston 1.5 years after I started there. But as part of that, I presented a model of house price dynamics, which said that the fundamental driving factor in buying a house is new mortgages. We mainly buy houses with borrowed money. So the monetary demand for houses is the change in mortgage debt. Okay. And then if you then say, well, you can relate the change in mortgage debt to the level of house prices. So it's the rate, it's in the rate of change of the change that gives you the change in house prices. And we made a very simple little model, which basically related the acceleration of mortgage debt to the change in house prices, and then fitted that to the data and found a ridiculously high correlation again, saying, yes, if rising house prices require accelerating mortgage debt. Now, that you can't accelerate forever. So at some point you go back for a plunge, and that's what happened with the 2008 crisis, and the Chinese might be going through the same thing as well right now. So it ultimately causes a collapse.
I don't want to dominate. And if Dan, you want to jump in here, you can shut me up anytime you want. But I wanted to make another comment that occurred to me in watching today's presentations. I'm trained as a macro money guy. Ty, you're doing macro modeling. Steve, I know obviously does macro modeling, and it's interesting. It's good. We should continue and whatever. Forrester, on the other hand, the creator of system dynamics, primarily, or at least started, the original idea was firm level modeling companies. Okay. And that's a good thing to do. But I think there is a lot of fertile ground to be plowed and in industry level modeling, where we really haven't done a lot there. The housing market, the housing industry, running shoes, steel, lumber, whatever, you name the industry, there's a lot of them. And modeling that and becoming an expert, a domain expert, as well as a modeling expert in a particular industry of interest to you. For that matter, you can trade the financial markets based on that, write a newsletter, have a website, whatever. I think for folks who are interested in dynamic modeling, if you want to build another macro model, come join us. But there's a bunch of them we've already talked about. But I think, the industry level area is ripe for dynamic modeling.
Yes. That's where you began, with your work with your factory.
Yeah, so that was actually the first application I was going to use, and how I found system dynamics, and really. And even now, like I have got some toy models of supply chain models, and I think the system dynamics and like real world application, like macroeconomic system dynamics, is really good as a teaching tool. But it's not really quantitative. I don't think you can build a quantitative macroeconomic model. I think that's too hard. I don't really believe in the predictive nature of modeling. You know what's going to happen tomorrow. You know a little less on day 2, even less on day 3. But as for, like, I have this little toy model, and I can it's a supply chain model, a cattle model. I actually took it out of John Sternman's business dynamics book and, built the hell out of it. And it can be quantitative. So I agree with Mike. There is, I think, a huge opportunity to expose system dynamics to multiple different industries. It's not being done, and you can produce quantitative models that produce real numbers that could be somewhat, and I hate using the word predictive, but predictive into the future, at least from maybe a business cycle factor, much like Jay Forster did originally with industrial dynamics, which really kicked it all off. What was that? 1965.
61 was the book.
61.
Yeah.
61. Yeah.
What about any logic on that front, Mike? From what I've seen of it, it's probably the most sophisticated combination of modeling techniques, and maybe best for doing things like factory modeling.
Yeah, it's really good. And they have, I think they call them libraries, where you can pull down, sort of drag and drop all sorts of sophisticated warehouse processes, terminals, if you want to have a truck terminal or whatever, little trucks, and you can design a warehouse, a generic one, or literally model your warehouse or your airport. And so these libraries are really, really, really good and quite sophisticated. And they're running.
Is it kind of?
Sorry.
Is it kind of like the Vinson molecules?
No,
it's just got pre-made structures.
Yeah, but much more visual.
Yeah, it's incredibly good. I had a PhD student who did a model of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis using any logic, and he had the system dynamic side generating a Goodwin-Minsky cycle, and then multi-agents inside the model using the any logic discrete modeling system. And it is, I mean, you said, Mike, yourself at one point, the guy was turning up trying to get people to get copies for free, and now he's selling for $3,000 a pop. It really is. Yeah. Incredibly sophisticated work, probably maybe the only profitable system dynamics program around.
Yeah, his problem getting it used in the government in the U.S. is it's Russian-made software. So not just the military and the U.S. government, but what I sometimes teach at Electric Boat and General Dynamics and Tektronix and places like that, and they can't use it because of the national security stuff. So.
Bloody hell,
really?
Honestly.
Yeah, no, actually I was I'm working on something. I'm basically copying I know, Mike, you'll know what Vinson molecules is. It's basically it's kind of like the general theory of system dynamics. It has every structure that you would use in building a system. So I've actually built that. I've half built it in Minsky, and I'd love Russell to actually apply it to one of the upcoming versions. So you'd click on a tab, and you'd have the pre-built structure. So like a third order smooth, instead of actually creating the 3 integral blocks and then the 3 parameters to do this third order smooth. You just click on it. It would apply it right onto the canvas.
Yeah.
And then you could change the variable names.
Yeah,
at the moment, yeah. Sorry, Mike. Yeah.
In Stella, they just came out with, they call them assemblies in Stella. They have the same thing, a library of the generic structures.
Yeah. I mean, we intend doing that, but I think we've got to finance to get it done. So all of Russell's and my efforts right now are going into designing Ravel, because with Ravel's capacity to attack the business intelligence market, we think we can make money out of that. And then with the money from that, we can actually finance Minsky as a hobby and bring it up to the level of power it actually needs. So, but making money out of system dynamics, I think, is any logic seems to be the only one that's done it, and now they're being stuck by being Russians. Great. But business intelligence, there's a huge market out there that wants easy ways to analyze complicated multidimensional data, and we're building that in Ravel. So if that comes off, then we'll add everything you want and more into Minsky.
Well, this is a perfect marketing strategy. We're not made in Russia. System dynamics, not produced in Russia.
Yeah.
Minsky.
I just hope Americans can hold the map that the right way. Otherwise, they might think we are Russia upside down.
So I wanted to circle back, if I may, to some of Ty's remarks about his large-scale macro model that he's working on in his presentation. So, and the use of macro models for quantitative analysis, whatever. So, one of the questions that we would always ask in our research group, and Forrester and Sturman used to beat this into our heads when we were out at MIT years ago, is we don't model a system, we model a problem from a systems perspective. So I think I've beaten it into my doctoral students. One of the first questions they would have asked you, Ty, is what problem are you trying to solve with your model?
Can we continue economic growth without affecting the biosphere and the climate?
Okay. So then we say, what's the problem in words, and then make a reference mode. So what does the problem statement or the curiosity look in terms of what's going on now in terms of time shapes? And then what would better or solved, improved mean? And how would those time shapes change? So that gets you to focus on what should be inside the model and what can we leave out, right? Because we're trying to simplify, not make a digital twin, right? The next thing that leaps to mind in terms of like, why do we build models, at least from Forrester and Sturman's perspective, the traditional system dynamics perspective, is redesigning the airplane. We're not trying to forecast the future. We're trying to say, all right, the airplane isn't flying well. We're not going to just throw the airplane away, but we can redesign it. Well, we have to first say, well, what's the problem? Is it has to fly higher, it has to fly faster, it has to carry more cargo, it has to be more fuel efficient, whatever, right? And then you say, how can we redesign things to make that happen? Third point is this: when we talk about redesigning the system, redesigning the airplane, what do we mean more precisely? Well, in system dynamics, we talk about feedback structure. It's feedback loops. We have policy resistance because of negative feedback loops. The policymakers try to pull the system this way, and their goals aren't aligned with everybody else. So everybody else pulls the system back this way. And you have policies that are ineffective. Or you have path dependency, where positive loops lock you in to a particular trajectory. So it's feedback processes that are causing our airplane to fly poorly, our economy, our industry, whatever. And you have to redesign the feedback processes, sever positive loops that are bad, add a governing negative loop if necessary someplace, and so forth. So this requires thinking in terms of loops. And Ty, you were discussing earlier, just trying to manually keep track of them is really hard, and you did it in a systematic way. And we really need tools to help us analyze dynamics from a feedback perspective. And economists, this is where you can get them, because economists, if they for a minute decide to be reasonable, say, look, let's just have a beer and chat, okay? What you'll often say is, there's nothing here that I don't know. But then you start showing them feedback loops, and they don't know that. I love taking a model that somebody's produced, an economist has produced, and I redo it in system dynamics and show them the feedback loops in their own model. And they have no idea those loops are there, nor do they know which ones are dominant and why and when and why that's causing their problems, let alone redesigning the feedback structure to make the system perform better. So I think that's where our advantage is, the feedback concept and how we use it and how we can develop our software to help us enhance our understanding of the feedback processes in our complex systems. So, why do we build macro models or industry models? That's how I would answer that question.
I agree. And actually, one of my plans, I'm not there yet, but I want to basically document each loop in isolation to tell the story. Because you can't really tell a story. You can't tell the story of the World 3 model by showing them the whole model. You just can't. But you can tell them the story loop by loop individually. So I agree.
One thing I like to do with the students is we'll build a Lotka-Volterra model. We'll pull it up on Wikipedia and say, all right, there's your Diffie-Qs. And over in another building, you do the traditional math thing. Let's just do it right here and now. And we make the Lotka-Volterra model. And then you simulate and you replicate the stuff in Wikipedia and all that. But then you say, what are the feedback loops here? And in that model, you can kind of manually just see them. But then you say, which ones are dominant? Which ones are causing that behavior? And what's funny is they never guess right. I didn't guess right the first time. But the software tools allow you to see the feedback loop dominance. And it's really enlightening and surprising to see which loops are dominating when, and even a little model like that. It's well known, but it's not a very big model at all.
Okay, so tell us, which are the dominant ones? I'm curious.
Sorry, what?
And
which are the dominant ones in that feedback?
I think, you can look at slices of time or over the whole course of the simulation run. I think it's from memory. I think it's the birth rate of the predators is the most dominant. I'd have to pull it up, but I think that's what it is. It's quite interesting, and because that wouldn't have been my guess because it's an oscillatory model. I thought a negative loop would be dominant, but it was a positive loop.
Okay, that's intriguing. Yeah,
I'd have to look at it again, but I think that's what it was.
Okay.
Actually, and I will add, I haven't talked to Russell in a few months. He's actually aiming to show that dominance with the Phillips diagram, even though it's very basic right now, where it shows the wire getting larger. Unfortunately, it doesn't have it hooked up to flows. It's just between each stock.
Yeah.
But that's very important. It's very important to see what's dominating. And in fact, one example is in your model where you extended it with a government function. So the dominant feedback effect is the loan level or credit level integral in the model. If you were to visualize that with thickening lines, that line would become the dominant line and it causes the instability versus just the traditional Goodwin two-state model where it goes back and forth. That stuff's interesting.
If you think about an economist who would do the sorts of things I was describing a moment ago, it would have been Bill Phillips, right? In the 1950s, he was arguing to add PID, proportional, integral, and derivative control, negative feedback processes to the macro economy, to government spending to stabilize the business cycle, right? So that's redesigning the system structure by adding a negative feedback process. And so he got it, but he was by training originally an engineer, right?
And in fact, I think if you look at what he was doing, he beat Forrester to the concept of system dynamics because his papers, I think he wrote these papers in 53, 52. And that was, I think, that's what Forrester's.
Forrester started 56 was the first paper.
Yeah, so the hand diagram he did, that feedback loop that he built then. I mean, Forrester again, that's giving him his due. He was designing mechanical servo feedback systems for the gun turrets in the Second World War Liberty ships. So in terms of actually practically doing it, he was ahead of Phillips again. So they're two remarkable engineers, and I wish they'd met. I wish they'd actually interacted with each other because they did such brilliant work. And the two of them could have reformed economics. Yep.
1950 mechanical models, economic dynamics, economica. I guess that's the name of the journal by Phillips.
Yeah.
One of the papers I have here.
Yeah, Economica.
Yeah.
And Phillips made, the Phillips machine was an analog computer, right? With tanks of water filling up and draining and what have you. I mean, with stocks and flows, right?
That was actually based on the system that on the Higgs Hansen Samuelson model, which of course, as I know, I know wrong. But he actually built an analog computer as well. And I don't know whatever happened to that. He actually lived literally with valves and resistors and so on. And that was a programmable model of the economy. So he was literally, I think in 1950, 51, 52, he was building analog computers. And every time I see a bloody neoclassical disparage the Phillips curve, I feel like grabbing one. I feel like drowning them in the Phillips machine. They deserve to go down that way because he was such a brilliant contributor to human knowledge, and these guys are a bunch of jerks.
Who destroyed the Phillips work? Was it Samuelson and Sallow, or was it the monetarists like Friedman and?
I think Phelps and Friedman.
They all just grabbed the Phillips curve, and I mean the trouble was that Phillips, the way that Phillips built the curve was he'd actually done. If you look at, I think the 53 paper, it might be Michael 55, I'm not sure. He had a circuit diagram with a PID controller inside there. And as part of it, he had a feedback between the level of economic activity and the rate of change of factor prices. And he simply drew a sort of hyperbolic function as part of it. And then he did the research to actually empirically see whether there was that feedback. On one weekend, he borrowed the department secretary's mechanical calculator and took it back home. He grabbed about 6 different data series, which were maintained by trade unions at the time because the trade unions kept records of who of the members were employed and who weren't, because the employed ones were paying fees and the unemployed ones weren't. So the record of unemployment came from the unions, and he then got the level of economic activity or price changes. There we go. Thank you, Ty. If you got the level of rate of change of money wages also from the trade unions, and then he put the two together, and what he got out of it was a very hyperbolic function relating the level of unemployment to the rate of change of money wages, and that he then I think he took data from 1861 to 1917 or something like that, and then he fitted it to data from 1942 to 1958, something of that region, and the current data fitted the curve he derived almost to a T, and instantly people thought, oh, here's a menu, we can choose this number, unemployment, to get that number of inflation. But when you look at the logic he gave for the actual nature of the feedback, he said there are three factors that determine the rate of change of wages. There's the level of unemployment, there's the rate of change of unemployment, and there's wage price spiral costs coming from largely from import costs coming in. So it was a three-dimensional model, and it was not something which is going to be a static, sit somewhere on a curve. It's going to be a feedback system, as you were saying, Mike, in a dynamic model. And it all got bastardized totally. And Phillips finally said if he knew how his work was going to be used, he would never have done it.
We are, everybody make sure you hit that like button before we end the show. Comments after, please. I like them. I usually reply to them all. If there's any good ones for Mike, Dan, or Steve, I will definitely relay it because I know they're busy guys and they don't want to sit around, looking at YouTube channels all the time. So I'll watch for them. Daniel, and also if you're watching on X, make sure you retweet or repost and like. And then, next time, come over here, join the chat. Daniel, any final thoughts? You haven't talked very much this show. What's on your mind?
Well, a couple things. Your third order, I guess, predator prey model with your greenery added, or the plants.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering what your vision is for that. Are you looking to do some sort of like genus study, or put some sort of like eukaryote sort of you could put the module of like total biodiversity into that section if you had to?
Yeah, okay. I could. I'm
Okay.
not going to because it would just unnecessarily I wanted to show that actually if we stopped emissions tomorrow, it doesn't mean our biodiversity comes back tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And actually that model, that very simplified model, will demonstrate that. Mm-hmm. Right. So I want those dynamics. Those dynamics are also eventually the bio matter. So plants and trees, I want to feed back so it becomes a carbon sink, a carbon land sink.
Oh, that's why you
so
put
that'll
green.
be important.
Yeah. Okay.
And then when I add the agricultural sector, that's actually going to squeeze out because we turned forests into flat farmland, which has a huge it's a huge ratio that is terraforming the planet right now.
Mm-hmm.
Our modern farmer, it is changing our climate. So that's why I want it in there. I don't want, each type of big cat, lions, leopards, and stuff. A predator is a predator, right? The question is, should I even have it in there if it's not providing any feedback dynamics? I'm not sure yet. So it's in there.
Interesting.
Right.
Interesting.
There could be, I could read a paper that says, the amount of wildlife in predators and carnivores and herbivores changes the happiness of human beings, and that might change the birth rate. I'm just being hypothetical here, but there might be that loop out there to find, right? So having it structurally in place might be important. A year down the road, let's say, and I'm writing a book on this model and it's done, and I realize, it doesn't need to be there. It won't be in there because it just takes computer processing power. My laptop is so tapped out right now from all these like models and these live streams, right? I have to make cuts every day.
Interesting. One thing I will add is that I thought was very interesting was the looping behaviors that system dynamics is modeling there's a book by Hofstadter called I'm a Strange Loop. And I thought that'd be really cool to integrate some of Hofstadter's thinking, I guess, into some agent-based modeling. And maybe that would bridge the, the macro with the agent-based. I don't know. I mean, it's just a rough, kind of idea, right? But that's Hofstadter's I'm a Strange Loop.
You're going to have to email me that one.
Yeah. Oh, and one more question for Mike. So anytime I try and avoid the word supply and demand, and I know that's really difficult, right? Because we were in the context that you were using, supply was actually like housing supply.
Mm-hmm.
But when I turn on the news and we listen to the crisis and we listen to housing shortages and supply, just the language of supply and demand seem to like pull us into that party of supply demand curves. And that's the anathema that I'm trying to stay away from. So it's like how do you use supply and demand without falling into the fallacies that the demand curves actually promulgate or
yeah, you
use
right? Minsky or Stella or something, right? Because what do you mean by supply? It could be the production of new housing, a building rate, a flow, or it could be the stock of existing housing. So it can be a flow concept, a stock concept, and what have you. And all of that is hidden when you're doing the traditional, two lines crossing at a point. So
yeah, that's why I mean it's like anathema. Like, don't even say supply and demand, because that's almost the watchword for somebody that just does not understand how a dynamic system or
the wrong name pops into their heads. Yeah.
And then we have like, no offense, Mike, but this is what I'm the noob here, right? And I'm like, I don't want to hear supply or demand on any explanation coming from the people that know what's going on, right? Because it's just not the complete picture, and it leads to the neoclassical dogmatic slumber.
A good point to end on, I think, Vince.
Yeah.
A good conversation.
We're running out of time here, Dan.
Yep. Okay. No, that's it. Those were my kind of points all put into.
Yeah. Good point. Good point to finish on.
So everybody, thanks for joining us another week. We haven't been canceled. Again, hit that like button. Subscribe to the Prof. Steve Keen channel if you haven't subscribed yet. Hit up some comments underneath the video. I like those. The algorithm likes it. If you were watching on X, hit that like button, repost button. We've got John Hearn next week. It's going to be really exciting. The clash of the post-Keynesian Steve Keen against the neoclassical John Hearn. It should be exciting. Until next week, for Steve Keen, Daniel Sanderson, Mike Radziki, bye-bye.